Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 9-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players. And I cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You can also follow me on social media. I'm at ChrisPennell16 on Twitter, CPen16 on IG. And if you want more content over on Patreon, it's always much appreciated. We got over 300 people there. You can get into the Discord, and you can get access to all the extra content that I put out every single day, including the spreadsheets, the cheat sheets, and all that fun stuff. So if you're interested, links in the description below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So the pitching on this slate, it doesn't get me as excited as the bats do, because we do have a Coors Field slate, and there's a lot of good bats on this. There's a lot of good bats on the slate. The pitching, they're kind of just fine options. There's some slates where I see pitchers and I'm like, yep, I am excited. I want to play those pitchers. This one, not so much. They're fine. I don't think they're awful, but they're okay. So we'll start up top with Patrick Corbin. He comes in at 10,400. He struck out 8 batters in each of his starts this season. And versus the Mets just about a week ago, he struck out 8, scored 21 fantasy points, and went 102 pitches. Did allow 8 hits and 3 runs, but overall, he is the best pitcher on this slate. Vegas likes him, only 4 runs against him. Slight favorite and 6.5 strikeouts. And if you're looking at his numbers last season, 3.59 xFIP, 29% K rate, 34% hard contact rate. Really good numbers all around. And obviously great versus lefties, and your 40% K rate versus them. And worst numbers versus righties, but they're still good numbers overall. 169 ISO given up and a 26% K rate. So if you have the money for Corbin, he's obviously the safest option on the slate because of how good he is. He scored 21 and 27 fantasy points so far to start the season, and that 27-point outing was against the Yankees. So obviously the guy's got great stuff, and the matchup versus the Mets isn't too scary. They got quite a few lefties like Conforto, McNeil, and Brandon Nimmo should be able to shut down, and just some other guys as well. Pete Alonso would be the big worry spot there, but I think for the most part, Corbin's going to be fine. If you got the money for him, I would feel pretty safe spending up for him, but I understand if you want to spend down because of Coors Field, because I really like a lot of those Coors Field bats. So drop it down to a probably more affordable option. We have Cal Gibson at 8,600 going up against a strikeout-happy team in Seattle. And I actually think Gibson is a really good option if you do want to save some salary and make him your SP1 tonight. You could honestly go Corbin SP1, Cal Gibson SP2, but you are going to be sacrificing some good bats there. But there is value on this slate that we can end up using. But Vegas likes him here, 60% chance for the win, one of the heaviest favorites on the slate. Only 4 runs against him, which is actually less than Corbin, and 5 strikeouts. And if you're looking at his numbers last season, they were pretty respectable. I know it's going to have red bars here, but that's because it's comparing it to 4 pitchers here or 5 pitchers here. So sample size isn't as big, but if you put that on a larger scale, it's not bad. 3-point xFIP is pretty good. 23% K rate, got a lot of ground balls at 51%, doesn't allow much fly balls whatsoever, only 23%. And the matchup versus the Mariners, I like it. If you're looking at their numbers last season and a little bit of mixed in with this season, they have a 25.7% K rate versus righties, 196 ISO, 100 WRC+. I like Kyle Gibson here. If you're looking at his first 2 starts this season, he struck out 9 in his last start versus Oakland, and he went 103 pitches, scored 21.9 fantasy points. And if you're looking at his first start, he had 93 pitches and struck out 4 versus Arizona. So pitch count's not going to be an issue here, and he's got strikeout upside. Like I just said, he had 9 last start, and I think he's a fine option. Seattle doesn't scare me much at all, so I think he's a fine SP2 or just fine SP1 on this slate if you want to save some money. Then a wild card here in Lance McCullers. He's 8,200, and he's had 1 good start this year versus the Mariners. And then after that, he's been pretty bad. So in his first start versus Seattle, he scored 20 fantasy points, went 6 innings, struck out 6. All was well for him. He scored around 20 fantasy points. Next start versus the Angels without Mike Trout, he gave up 4 runs, only struck out 4 and 91 pitches. Then in his next start versus the Diamondbacks, that's where things fell off a cliff. He scored negative 10 fantasy points, allowed 7 hits, 8 runs, only struck out 1, 61 pitches, and he got yanked. So there's some downside here with Lance McCullers. We know the guy's got good stuff, and he was great before the injury, but he has struggled so far, but this is a pretty soft matchup versus the Giants. Now, you do prefer lefties versus the Giants for the most part, but it's still a pretty soft matchup overall. Now, I'm not seeing a Vegas total yet for this game. I'd have to imagine the Giants are going to have one of the lower totals, but I do think McCullers is still a little bit risky here, just based off of recent performance. But the Giants lineup is really nothing to be too scared of. If you're looking at their splits last season and this season combined, they have a 22.5% K rate. They don't strike out a lot, but pretty weak overall lineup. 169 ISO, 304 WOBA, 87 WRC+. So I think McCullers is fine here. We only have 2020 stats available for McCullers because he didn't pitch in 2019. So I got nothing listed here because it's a small sample size. But he is sporting a 9.22 ERA to start the season. So obviously it hasn't been going well for McCullers, but he certainly has upside. And speaking of another guy that's got some risk and some upside, we have Dustin May at 7,700. Now, he just got done playing the San Diego Padres team, and he performed very, very well, as he went 6 innings and struck out 8 and 82 pitches. And that's the thing about San Diego. They have a really good lineup. There's plenty of power in that lineup, plenty of good players, Tatis, Grisham, Machado, and others. But they do strike out quite a bit versus righty, so it's kind of a risk-reward. But Vegas really likes Dustin May here. Only 3.54 runs against him, which I believe might be the lowest on the slate. I think so. And a 60% chance for the win, only 4 strikeouts, but I do like the matchup versus San Diego. Again, they do have some pop, but if you're looking at their splits versus righties last season, they had a 26.2% K rate, 89 WRC plus 308 WOBA. Really good team versus lefties, but I like Dustin May here. I like the price tag. I think he's a fine SP2 option. Wouldn't make him your SP1, unless you're really looking to stack bats. But Dustin May's got some good numbers. Looking at his numbers last season, 3.7 xFIP, 23% K rate. Has good control, only a 4% walk rate, and only 0.52 home runs per 9 innings. So I think Dustin May's fine here. I like the price tag. Vegas likes him. He's pitching at home. In San Diego, I prefer righties compared to lefties. And then if you want to get down and dirty, we have Robbie Ray here at 6,300. Now, this is a very high-risk, medial to high-reward option with Robbie Ray because he's got plenty of strikeout upside, but we're pitching in Coors Field. Now, he's had success versus the Rockies before, but most of that comes from when he's away from Coors Field. Looking at his numbers last season, he scored like 7 and 4 points in Coors, then he had one game around 20 points. So he was like 1 for 3 in good games in Coors Field. So it's very risky, but he does have a 32% K rate, 3.7 xFIP. These are good numbers, but he can struggle with walks, he can struggle with hard contact, and he can struggle with giving up home runs. 1.55 home runs per 9 innings, and we're in Coors Field, so it's not the best combo in the world. He's great versus lefties, he's great versus righties in the strikeout department, but those power numbers go up, and so does the walk rate. Only a 6% walk rate to lefties, but a 221 ISO to righties and a 12% walk rate. A little bit of a higher strikeout rate, but oh man, he is risky because I think there's a good chance Arenado, even Blackmon, and Story do some damage against him. But I would assume he's going to give up a few runs. Now he's 6,300. It's not like he's 10K, so that wouldn't kill you. At 6,300, if he can get like 5 to 7 strikeouts and give up 3 to 4 runs, I think you're going to be fine as long as you can nail home runs on this slate and you can just stack up cores. Now, the problem is if you're playing Robbie Ray, you're probably not going to be stacking up the Rockies bats because that doesn't make too much sense correlation-wise. But I'd assume you're probably stacking up the Diamondbacks. But I think Robbie Ray's fine in tournaments. I don't know if you'd really want to go there in cash games because Arenado and Story are such great plays. But like in Vegas, he's at 6 strikeouts. 6 strikeouts, I think that would get the job done as long as he doesn't get absolutely shelled for like 6 to 7, 8 runs. If he can get like anywhere from 2 to 5 runs given up, but he's going to get like 5 to 7 strikeouts, I think you might be able to skid by at 6,300. I do like that price tag. So he's a risky play, but I do think there is some upside there in that price tag. So now we'll just move on to the bats. You're going to see a lot of Coors Field here, but that's what happens when there's a Coors Field slate. So we'll start with Stephen Vogt at 4,500. He's got some pretty good history versus John Gray, actually. Or no, I'm thinking of Blackmon. Coors Field mixed me up. But he's still 3 for 5 for a home run versus him. I just checked. It wasn't Stephen Vogt. But still at 3 for 5 versus him with a home run. And I like the lefties versus John Gray. John Gray is not a bad pitcher whatsoever. But he does struggle with lefties. And we're in Coors Field. So literally everybody is in play here for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Everybody's in play for the Rockies for the most part. Do prefer the righties there. But we'll talk about Blackmon in a little bit. But I like Stephen Vogt if you're spending up a catcher. He's got good splits versus right-handed pitching if you're looking at his numbers. 233 ISO, 271 batting average, 115 WRC plus, and over a 500 slugging. So I do like Vogt if you can spend up. Kurt Suzuki, he's more of a mid-range option. He comes in at 3,700 going up against the lefty Steven Matz. Now, Steven Matz is not an awful pitcher, but he does struggle with right-handed bats a little bit. Does give us some power versus them. We saw that in his first start versus the Nationals earlier this season, which I believe was last week. He gave up 5 runs, gave up home runs to Josh Harrison, Howie Kendrick, and I forget who else, but they actually had a pretty good game versus him. I could see a similar result here. Now, I was kind of forced to play the Nationals that slate because there just wasn't any other good options besides Coors Field, so we kind of looked for them for value. But I think they're decent in tournaments here. 4.5 runs, which isn't great, but it's not awful either. And I do like the righties here for the most part. And if you're looking at Suzuki's splits versus lefties last season, pretty solid. 239 ISO, 143 WRC plus, a 343 batting average, only a 12% strikeout rate. So I think Suzuki's fine. He's going to be hitting in the middle of the order. and I like that price tag as well. Then if you need a value option, I don't mind looking at Austin Romine either, but Wilson Ramos at 2,800. I always like him versus lefties because he's got some pretty darn good splits. Kind of a similar player to Kurt Suzuki versus lefties in the terms of both being catchers. But if you look at the splits, they are pretty similar. They both have really low strikeout rates versus lefties. Both are actually at 12%. 346 batting average, and Suzuki's at a 343 batting average. A little bit less power with Ramos, 178 ISO, but I still like him quite a bit at that price tag. I don't like picking on Patrick Corbin because he's obviously got elite stuff, but I like that price tag for Wilson Ramos, and if you're in a pinch, I don't mind that whatsoever. So I'll drop down to first base. We have Christian Walker, 4,300. Anybody and everybody in Coors Field is in play here, and Walker as a righty, he actually has better splits versus righties with a 232 ISO compared to a 179 ISO to lefties, 113 WRC plus, and your 270 batting average. And just overall, I like all the Diamondbacks here, and they're actually pretty cheap for the most part. There's a couple of expensive ones, like Ketel Marte's 5,000, but you can actually get some decent prices on these guys, so they're actually pretty easy to stack. They're not like they're 6,000 like some of these Rockies bats, so I'm kind of liking the Diamondback side better than the Rocky side just from a point per dollar standpoint. But John Gray is a good pitcher, so I don't think it's going to be a walk into the park for these guys. He's got a 24% carry to righties and only a 172 ISO given up. I say only, but that's still it's decently high. But 185, two lefties, and a 345 WOBA, but two lefties as well with a double-digit walk rate. So I preferred lefties, but everybody's in play here, and I don't mind Christian Walker. I like that price tag, and he's definitely got some pop in his bat. And if you're looking for some value options, I got three listed here. We have CJ Cron, 3,100, going up against the lefty in Dallas Keuchel. So I liked a lot of the Detroit value plays yesterday. It really didn't work out whatsoever. It was actually one of my worst lineups I think I've ever put together. I think I finished like in near last place in my double ups and stuff. That was rough. Like I had nobody do anything. Interhini got me like 1 point. DeGrom did do that great, and my bats did absolutely nothing. I think Kepler with 9 points is my highest scoring bat, but I like CJ Cron versus lefties. He's got great numbers, 310 ISO, 160 WRC plus, and your 330 batting average last season. In Dallas Keuchel, you want righties against him. Lefties, it's pretty much just a stay away. He had a 30% carry to lefties last season, a 162 ISO, and a near 70% ground ball rate. But to the righties, 16% carry rate, so you cut that strikeout rate in half versus lefties, 161 ISO. Similar power numbers, but the strikeout rate's really what makes me want to play the righties against him because that drops it way down. Ground balls also go down, and the fly balls also go up. So I like Caesar Cron at that price tag. Jake Lamb, this is just cheap Coors exposure, only 2,700. I wish he was third base eligible as well because I don't have really many third basemen listed here. But if you're in a pinch and you need 2,700 first baseman in Coors Field, I don't mind Jake Lamb here. If you're looking at his splits versus righties last season, he was actually better versus lefties. Well, 435 ISO, 192 WRC plus, and a 300 batting average. But I do prefer lefties versus John Gray, and he's dirt cheap, and he's in Coors Field, so I think that's really all that needs to be said. And Miguel Cabrera, he's kind of like the watered-down version of CJ Cron. He's still got good splits versus lefties. He just has less power. 216 ISO to lefties, 340 batting average, which is very, very good, and a pretty low strikeout rate at 19%. But I prefer Cron at 3,100 because there's a little bit more pop in that bat. But Miguel's fine at 2,500. He's near minimum price. Then dropping down to second base, we have Ketel Marte at 5,000. Now, he's good versus lefties and righties, and I actually do prefer him versus lefties a little bit more, but versus righties, he's still actually got some really good numbers. He got a 150 WRC plus, a 330 batting average, 250 ISO, 404 WOBA, and near 400 on base percentage, only a 14% K rate as well. So I obviously like all the Diamondbacks. Ketel Marte, I believe, is the most expensive one, but he's certainly play here. He should be leading off, and I like the Diamondbacks quite a bit, even though John Gray's a respectable pitcher, so I'm not like just trying to pick on him, but we're in Coors Field, so I guess I'm going to have to pick on him for the most part. And then Garrett Hampson should be leading off for the Rockies, 4,300 going to the lefty, and Robbie Ray. Now, I think Robbie Ray is interesting in tournaments, but then again, we are in Coors Field, and the Rockies do have an applied team total of about 6.5, which is going to be the highest on the slate. Hampson, not the best batter in the world, but leading off for the Rockies at 4,300, projected to, is always going to grade out pretty well. So I don't mind Garrett Hampson whatsoever. Jonathan Scope, 3,700. Going up against the lefty in Dallas Keuchel. Now, I mentioned with Detroit yesterday, they did absolutely nothing, but I'm willing to play some of these cheap lefties just to be able to round out some Coors Field bats for the most part. I'm not like actively trying to stack against Keuchel, but I think they're fine as one-offs. Applied team totals all the way down to 4.11, so I'm not really excited about any of these guys, but they do grade out as pretty decent values versus some left-handed pitching. If you're looking at Scope's numbers versus lefties last year, get a near 300 ISO, 136 WRC plus, near 280 batting average. So I think he's fine. Dallas Keuchel is a fine pitcher, but I think we can target some of these cheap righties against him, just for some value. Then Starlin Castro, 3,500, going up against the lefty in Steven Matz. If you're looking at Castro's numbers versus lefties last season, only a 16% K rate, 323 batting average. Not a ton of power, 207 ISO, but still respectable numbers versus lefties. And if you're in a pinch, I don't mind him. And he actually has a better matchup versus Matz than I would say Scope has a better matchup, or than Scope does versus Dallas Keuchel. So both are fine. And then dropping out to third base, there was only two options I really liked on this slate, so I think you're either spending up for Arenado or you're spending down a little bit for Eduardo Escobar. So I'm planning just to go Coors Field here, but Arenado, 6,300, super duper expensive. I believe this is the most expensive he's been all season. But this is a great spot versus Robbie Ray. Anytime Arenado is going up against lefty in Coors Field, he is arguably the top play on the entire slate. He's got 300 ISO versus lefties, 416 on base percentage, a 15% strikeout rate, 315 batting average, just elite numbers all around, and those numbers go up if you just split it to Coors Field specifically. So Arenado, just salary aside, he's arguably the best play on the entire slate. And if you want to save nearly half that, you can go with Eduardo Escobar at 3,700. I do prefer the lefties here versus John Gray, and Eduardo Escobar is a switch hitter. If you're looking at his splits versus right-handed pitching last season, 236 ISO, 103 WRC plus, 256 batting average, I think he's fine. Again, I like all the Coors Field bats, and I think the Diamondbacks actually come in as a pretty good value. It's only 3,700. He just seems a little bit too cheap there. Then going down to shortstop, we have another Coors Field bat in Trevor Story, 6,100. And anytime Arenado and Story face a lefty in Coors Field, they're going to be some of the top plays on the entire slate. He's a little less expensive than Arenado, and I feel like we could just drop down to Eduardo Escobar at 3,700. So if you had to pick between the two, either Arenado or Story, I might side with Story just because the other options at shortstop aren't as good as Trevor Story, in my opinion. Meanwhile, with Arenado, we could just cut that salary in half and play Eduardo Escobar in Coors Field as well. So it might be the way I lean, but I mean, both are fine options. But I feel like Trevor Story's in a more, I don't know, it just seems like he's in a better position to spend up on him over Arenado. But it's close. Both are fine options, obviously. But Story, you gotta like him. 250 ISO versus lefties last season, 314 batting average, elite numbers all around. I like the righties versus Robbie Ray. Obviously, he makes sense. Trey Turner, if you want to save some salary going up against Steven Matz, I don't mind it because there is some stolen base upside here. Obviously, Trey Turner, one of the fastest guys in the entire league, and Steven Matz is one of the worst pitchers at holding runners. I believe he was in the bottom 5 last year at holding runners percentage-wise. So I like the stolen base upside with Trey Turner. He's actually got better splits versus right-handed pitching, quite a bit actually. But he's still got a 316 batting average versus lefties, and I like the stolen base upside for the most part. So I don't mind Trey Turner. Jorge Polanco, his price came up a little bit, but Adrian Hauser is not a bad pitcher by any means, but I do prefer lefties versus him. He's very, very tough on righties. So if we're going to look at his splits, he only gives up a 126 ISO to righties and a 25% strikeout rate and a near 65% ground ball rate. But if you go to lefties, those numbers do drop off quite a bit. A 190 ISO given up to lefties, 347 WOBA, 25% fly ball rate, and a 43% ground ball rate, so in a double-digit walk rate as well. So I like the lefties here. Jorge Polanco is a switch hitter. He hits right-handed pitching better, so he does grade out pretty well versus Adrian Hauser. I wouldn't say the Twins are like an elite stack on this slate, but I think they're viable. Only 4.3 runs in Vegas, which isn't great, but I do think some of these lefties are in plays one-offs, but I'm not really looking to absolutely just stack up all these guys. Then if you need a value option, we have Nico Goodrum at 3,800 going against Dallas Keuchel. I think you can target some of these one-off righties. He's a switch hitter, but if you're looking at his numbers versus lefties last season, he had a 361 batting average versus them. And not a ton of pop or anything, only a 155 ISO, but a 411 on base percentage, and at 3,800, you're not asking for much, and he's fine for value. I don't mind Nico Goodrum. Then going down to the outfield where we always have a ton of fun options. So we have Charlie Blackmon. Now, he's a GPP play only for me. I don't think you have to go there in cash games because it's lefty-on-lefty matchup. But Charlie Blackmon, like I was talking about with Stephen Vogt, I got them mixed up. He absolutely owns Robbie Ray. I'm not a big BVP guy because I think that's a little bit noisy, but he's got some great BVP versus Robbie Ray, and it's a lefty-on-lefty matchup. Like, just to read the numbers, Charlie Blackmon is 20 for 46 with 5 home runs and only 6 strikeouts versus Robbie Ray. And with someone that has a 30% strikeout rate, that's pretty darn good. So Charlie Blackmon has Robbie Ray's numbers. Now, I do prefer righties versus Robbie Ray, but Charlie Blackmon actually had more power versus left-handed pitching last season. Overall, I prefer Blackmon versus righties better, but he did have more pop versus them, and he's absolutely owned Robbie Ray in the past. And the thing is, with only having 6 strikeouts versus him, I think that's actually pretty impressive. So, not a big BVP guy, but I'm kind of buying into it a little bit with Charlie Blackmon here. I do think he's going to go pretty low owned on this slate just because he's 5,800, and people are going to want to jam in Trevor Story, Nolan Arenado, and there's plenty of value in the outfield today, so I don't think he's absolutely necessary, but I still think he's a fine option in tournaments. Then dropping down to JD Martinez, who gets a matchup versus a lefty, and pretty much anytime JD's facing a lefty, as long as it's not like an elite lefty, he's going to be on my radar, going up against Ryan Yarbrough. If you're looking at JD's splits versus lefties last season, they're just out of this world. 482 ISO, 242 WRC plus, over 400 batting average. I know I got to start mixing in the 2020 statistics, but it's still such a small sample size, so we'll get there at some point, but still using last season's numbers for the most part. But JD's always been good versus lefties, so nothing changes there. He just has amazing numbers versus them last season. If you're looking at Yarbrough's splits, he's not a bad pitcher, and he actually gave it more power to lefties last year, but I still think JD's obviously in a great home run spot versus Yarbrough here, the lefty. Then going back to Coors Field, we have Starling Marte at 4,700 going against John Gray. Marte's good versus both sides of the plate. Overall, he's a better hitter versus righties versus lefties, and 93 WRC plus, only a 313 WOBA. But those numbers go up quite a bit to righties, actually, with a 365 WOBA, 127 WRC plus, and over a 300 batting average. So I think Starling Marte is an excellent play. John Gray, I do prefer the lefties, but we're in Coors Field, and I do like Marte quite a bit here. He's really good versus right-handed pitching. Max Kepler, 4,600. Like I mentioned with Jorge Polanco, he is very tough on righties, but he does struggle a little bit versus lefties, and Max Kepler is a pretty good righty smasher. He's good versus lefties too, but I prefer Kepler versus righties, and he's a fine option. You guys know I'm a sucker for Max Kepler, so anytime he's in a decent matchup, he's going to make this list. Same goes with Michael Brantley. We got the 2 GOATs in a row, Kepler and Brantley, but I like the price tag here going up against Logan Webb. And anytime Brantley's going up against an average or below average right-handed pitcher, we got to have interest. Now, his price has come up dramatically from the start of the season. Remember when he was like 2,800 to 3,000? Those were just freebies. Now at 4,600, we got to think about it. But he had great splits versus righties last year with a 323 batting average, only an 8% strikeout rate. He's one of the elite contact hitters in the league, and just overall really good numbers. If you're looking at Webb's numbers, he wasn't. I mean, he's actually worse versus righties, but I mean, I'm gonna side with Brantley over Logan Webb here. So I don't mind Brantley if you want to just another mid-range option, but I would prefer trying to get the Coors Field bats there. But I think he's fine as a one-off. Matt Kemp, 4,500, just another righty on lefty matchup versus Robbie Ray. I do think Robbie Ray has some interest or has some appeal in tournaments, but I'm gonna side with the Rockies bats more so than not. And if you're looking at Kemp's splits last season versus lefties, he had a 286 ISO compared to a .022 ISO versus righties, and a negative 15 WRC plus. So definitely like Kemp here versus lefties, and he's a fine option. Definitely a fine option. Wasn't the biggest sample size in the world, but definitely like Kemp at that price tag in Coors Field. I missed when he was below 4K though. 4,500 seems like a bit much for Kemp, but they're all fine options. Eddie Rosario, 4,400. He's like the same play as Max Kepler for the most part, but he's always usually just a little bit cheaper. Kepler typically in the leadoff position, and Eddie Rosario typically in the cleanup position. They're both fine options. They're both high contact hitters with plenty of pop versus right-handed pitching, and I do prefer the lefties versus Adrian Hauser. So Eddie Rosario, I think he's a fine option. 286 ISO to lefties last season, only a 14% strikeout rate. Or I'm sorry, that was Matt Kemp. 170 ISO versus lefties compared to a 244 ISO to righties, 518 slugging, 275 batting average, and just overall really strong numbers, only a 14% strikeout rate. So don't mind Eddie Rosario for using some of those lefties versus Adrian Hauser, but I'm really not going my way to stack the Twins today, but I think some of these lefties are fine as one-offs. Then Cole Calhoun, Coors Field, I think he's going to be a pretty popular option on this slate at only 4,100, especially if he's batting second. We do want the lefties versus John Gray for the most part, but literally the whole entire lineup is in play, but gotta like Calhoun if you're looking at splits versus righties last season. 245 ISO, 240 batting average, but I like the power numbers there, and he's pretty cheap, and you're going to have some interest in Cole Calhoun. I would imagine he's going to be very high owned at that price tag. David Peralta, same thing. He's only 3,900. Going to be hitting lower in the order, but I like lefties versus John Gray. And if you're looking at his splits versus righties last season, a near 300 batting average, 280 ISO, 351 on base percentage, 116 WRC+. Prefer the lefties versus John Gray, so David Peralta checks out at a pretty good price tag. And then there wasn't many just absolute dumpster diving options, but Kevin Pillar should be leading off at 3,000 versus a lefty. And looking at his splits last season versus lefties, he had a 241 ISO and only an 8% strikeout rate. So I like that. I like the price, especially if he is leading off. But I think that's all I wanted to go through. So that's going to be it for the video, guys. Hope it was helpful. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Really helps me out. Really appreciate it. Hit the like button as well. I think I'm losing my voice, so it's a good thing this video is about over. So hope you guys enjoy your Monday and enjoy some baseball later tonight.